Pleasure to be here.
Okay. I'm a big fan of your work, but I don't know if our listeners are as a fan as I am. And I wanted to you work in the field of sense making, and maybe I wanted to get a brief like definition, maybe to make it uh like approachable for our listeners. And why do you think it's like important in today's world, sense making? I mean.
Okay, so academically, there are five schools of sense making. You've got Calvike, you've got Russell, you've got Dervin, you've got Klein, and then you've got mine. We define sense making as how do you make sense of the world so that you can act in it. And that comes with the concept of sufficiency. You never know everything you would like to know, but what can I do based on what I do know? So there's that pragmatic side. The naturalizing element of what we do is to root what we do in the natural sciences. So the way we develop methods is we'll spend 5, 6, 7 years working around a subject, reading in physics, biology, chemistry, philosophy, whatever. And then there's a day where everything kind of like seems to come together. And then it moves from theoretical to practical stage over 3 to 4 years, and then it becomes a formal method within the wiki. So we're very much rejecting the case-based approach because you can never get enough cases. And the world is just changing too quickly at the moment to use past practice to deal with things. But there are things we know from natural science, like how people make decisions, which aren't going to change. So we base on that.
Okay, and is there anything like actually in the actual context of the world, do you think it's a critical capacity to develop? Do you think
Yeah.
it's something?
Well, I mean, the world is flexing. Nothing is ever going to be the same after COVID anyway. And with climate change and with the growth of populism, we'll probably see the first mass heat deaths of humans in the next 5 to 10 years, and that's going to shake things up, both in terms of people's perception and refugees. So there's good and bad news coming. And I think, therefore, the ability to respond in the instance to actually handle things without cases is key. And there's sort of an irony there because human beings evolved to think what's called abductive reasoning, which involves abstraction, it involves art, it involves metaphor. And we're really good at situations where there's no training data. But AI, which we're now starting to over-depend on, entirely relies on its training data sets. It works inductively. Therefore, it's actually not going to handle novelty in the same way. So I think the abductive skill, the ability to handle novelty, the ability to work without prior examples, but based on a scientific basis, so you've got a degree of certainty. That's a key feature in the modern world.
Okay, now more on the subject of AI. If we start relying more and more on AI, what are the potential problems that can emerge from not including the actual human
You're frozen.
aspect on decision on sense making, let's say?
Hi, Thomas. You've unfrozen now.
Oh, did my question never came through?
You just said more on the topic of AI,
Oh, okay.
and then you
Sorry.
froze, so you'll need to repeat that bit.
Okay. And more on the subject of AI, what's the potential problems that can emerge from like not having relying more on it and not including the human aspect on sense making in general?
I mean, there's several. I mean, there's a good paper on this, which the title says AI bullshits, human beings hallucinate. And so human beings have learned how to use hallucination, imagination, fragmented memories, and we entangle those with multiple sensory experiences. So human beings are handling oral, visual, scent, and things we don't fully understand yet. And we're using our imaginations, whereas large language models, which to my mind are a very limited aspect of AI anyway, people have forgotten about things like neural networks and genetic algorithms, basically are only working off text, which is very limited. And they're only working off the text that they're given. So what they're doing is basically creating the most probable textual combinations. Now, as search tools and ideas tools, to a extent, they're quite powerful. I've used use ChatGPT and it's got utility. I'm not sure about its impact on climate change, but that's another matter. But what it can't do is it can't exercise the human ability to discriminate between true and false hallucinations and good and bad and useful and non-useful hallucinations. So that's one danger. I think the second danger is, and I had this argument with Sam Polizano when he took over at IBM, and he said we can get rid of middle managers with AI. And I said, but where the hell do you think the next set of directors are going to come from if you get rid of middle management? So there are things that AI can do better than us, but if we don't do them, we don't develop the high capacity. And I think the third thing, if you want a general rule, if anybody says, I've got evidence that we were more productive because we used LLMs, I mean, there was a lot of consultancy reports on this. You have to fundamentally challenge the value of what they were doing in the first place. If an LLM can do better than a human being in consultancy, then the consultancy was pretty crap in the first place.
So I was reading the other day a post you commented on or reposted around like how if you introduce AI or certain like more productivity to like systems that aren't working okay, you're just going to accelerate towards more mistakes, let's say, or the contrary
You're
to
going to dumb down.
down.
And the other problem with big LLMs, if they're now feeding off their own output, and if a model feeds off its own output, it's going to get polluted and perverted anyway. So I think there are issues there. I mean, I'll give an illustration. I asked ChatGPT what I thought about the subject the other day, and it got it really badly wrong. I then gave it a paper I'd written on the subject and asked it what the objections would be, and it got the objections pretty right. Because, of course, the objections are coming from conventional thinking, not from novel thinking. Yeah, so I think we just need to be aware. I mean, the whole point about a tool is when you pick it up, it should fit your hand. You shouldn't have to re-engineer your brain to fit the tool. And a lot of people are dumbing themselves down to the level of LLMs. Yeah, and that's the problem. It's not that they will exceed us in intelligence, but at the moment we're planning to meet them halfway.
Yeah, I'm thinking about sense making mainly. I mean, it's about figuring out patterns. Let's say how how would we manage to not fall into like false patterns and
Well,
false
it's
narratives.
interesting that a lot of the elite American schools have removed computers from their classrooms. And fascinatingly, a lot of the tech bros are the ones sending their kids there because you need to develop those capabilities, before and after puberty. I mean, I was walking in the hills when I was 7. And that gives me sensory capability, which if I hadn't started till I was 20 or 30, I wouldn't have acquired in terms of understanding landscapes and things like that. So I think we need to understand that human beings interact with each other and with the environment in complex ways we don't yet fully understand. And that we don't yet fully understand is critical because LLMs are only dealing with a limited aspect of what we do understand. So I think, to me, that's the key issue, right? It's search mechanisms, yes. Ideas generation within limits, yes. Working in established fields, yes, but they're lowest common denominator systems, not highest common factor systems.
So mainly by being trained on data and past data, let's say, any novel problem wouldn't be able to be solved through AI, let's say.
Well, they might throw out ideas, but your other problem is the cultural bias of the training data sets. I mean, if you read the paper Scholastic's Parrots, which was written by a Google employee and published by an ex-Google employee because they fired him, and it basically showed the bias of the training data sets. It was biased towards white males. Yeah. And if you use historical data, all you're doing is reflecting past biases.
And I'm really interested in the topic of like education, how we're gonna be like how we're gonna prepare ourselves for this to manage these kinds of tools, and what kinds of capacities or faculties should we as children mainly develop to deal with this?
I think there's several. I mean, first of all, realize LLMs are quite good in a lot of natural science fields where you're not dealing with attitudes and you're dealing with codified facts. Yeah. So that can be quite useful. I think in education, you've got to develop critical capability. You've got to create the ability to sense patterns in things. You've got to create the ability to exercise human judgment. And I'll give you my standard example on this. When I went up to school at the age of 11, well, I went to primary school. This was secondary school. You were allowed to wear long trousers. I remember that. If you had to walk to school in the British winter of 1963 in shorts, you learned to be fairly tough, all right? And I still remember walking to the front of the classroom on the Friday, and I got given a little record card, and it said, "You support capital punishment." Now, at the time, my mother was leading the Labour Party campaign in North Wales against capital punishment, which got abolished a few years later. So the teacher was being slightly wicked. But I had to speak for something I profoundly disagreed with for 7 minutes without preparation. We did that every week from the age of 11 to 18. Now, that process made us critical. It made us generalists because we never knew what we were going to hit with, so we read everything. It was a really simple process in the educational system which generated behavior. These days, the educational system thinks it needs to teach everything rather than create processes by which those things emerge. So I think that's one key aspect. I think we also need to increase the engagement of schools in their communities. And if I had my way, I'd abolish private schools and I'd go back to geography-based schools and make sure that people, the pressure of middle-class parents in every school. Yeah? And so when I went to school, everybody from the area went to the same school. You had to learn to live with people from different backgrounds from yourself. Yeah, now you've got this, and it's interesting. The school concentration is like the AI concentration. It builds elitism into the way in which you're trained and the people you interact with.
And regarding this topic you just mentioned, how would this be related to what you usually call like epistemic justice and how you were using children?
Yeah, but Beth, who works for me, well, or I work for Beth, or we both work for each other. She's a key member of the team. Has a wonderful way of phrasing this. She says, "Old wives tell tales. Old men are considered philosophers." And that's epistemic injustice. Yeah. So a key aspect of our work is not to allow experts from outside to interpret people's experiences. We develop distributed ethnography so people interpret their own experience, because power lies in interpretation, not in content. Now, again, that's a big danger with LLMs because people are now starting to codify, to transcribe people's stories, use LLM to interpret them. Well, A, the transcription loses nuances of tone, which is quite important. And B, it's prejudices by its own bias system, and people lose their right. They become, to quote Alistair, anxious stutterers in their own existence. Yeah. So interpretation is key. The right to tell stories is key. The right to interpret your own experience is key, and all of that goes into this bucket of what's called epistemic justice.
And also, people would be like children would be in that scenario be also losing or their capacity to actually interpret, right? The stories.
Yeah, and we run programs with children as school ethnographers. So we send children into their communities to gather stories on a regular basis. And that's really powerful because, firstly, nobody refuses a kid on a school project, so they get better data than market researchers and consultants. And secondly, they're actually learning and people are learning from them in the process. And we've got a big ambition on that. I mean, we're looking for funding on this at the moment. We've already proved it in 3 countries and 3 continents, which is we really want every kid at the age of 16 in every school in the world to be an ethnographer into their community for a year. Because that means we know we had valid data, whereas with the internet, you have no idea whether your data is valid or not. So we're looking at how do we focus on the input, not the output.
Okay, and I'm sorry to be. I wanted to go a bit deeper into this because I'm curious about how does this project come about? I mean, how do you what are the children actually doing? What kind of stories are they looking for? What are they doing?
Well, I mean, you can start. One of the ways we start it in sort of week 1 is go and find somebody in your grandparents' generation and ask them to tell the story of their life that they think you should remember. Yeah, those are called sacred stories, and that's a really good starting point because those are the stories which are told and retold in the communities. But then you can vary it. You might say, go and find somebody who lives on their own to get a story. Go and talk to the coach of your local sports club and interview them about what they do and why they do it. So you can have multiple subjects on that. Yeah. But what you're doing from that is you're gathering the underlying sentiment. And if you look at the recent American election, that's one of the things the Democrats got wrong. I mean, they thought they were basically marketing to Yale graduates, and they were believing what they were told in focus groups and in surveys. The reality is they weren't dealing with the sentiment, the street stories, which is where we've always worked. Street stories matter.
And how would you come to, like, after you gathered like the information from different individuals, how do you put together how do you make sense of all of that
Well,
information?
it's already been made sense of because the people who input the data do the quantitative interpretation of that data. So we've got quantitative data with an explanatory narrative at scale coming in real time. And then it's just visualization or statistics to represent that. We don't do secondary interpretation. Primary interpretation is done at the point of entry.
Okay, great. Um, another topic, a little detour. Another topic I wanted to talk about is yesterday you posted again on this
You're frozen again.
on this subject of sorry, I'm back.
Yeah.
On the topic of how of this problem of inner development as the main driver of change. I wanted to.
That particular bit of
I love it.
nonsense. Yeah.
What?
That particular bit of nonsense.
Yeah, I agree, but I wanted to maybe go deeper into that because I see a lot of people like falling into that trap.
Well, it's a North Atlantic phenomenon. I'm always surprised when people in Latin America fall into it, but it is a dominant imperial culture. So basically, you take it back to Freud and Jung. You can take it back to the Reformation if you want, which is the primary focus on the individual choice, and individual motivation. And you see that with Freud and Jung and the development of the subconsciousness, and then you get into this whole there's an inner state and an outer state, and the outside world is different from the inner state and stuff like that. And okay, you could justify that 150 years ago, but not with modern science. You can't. We know that human consciousness is a distributed function of the body, the brain, the social environment, the physical environment. All of these things are constantly interacting. They're deeply entangled. It's very messy. So the idea that you change a system by changing how people feel about the system is not only flawed, it's dangerous. There's a phrase from Homer here called lotus eating. It's a way of feeling good about the world, but not really having to change it.
So what would you say is like the main um flaw and all of that? Because maybe the inner part is maybe happening,
Frozen again.
or maybe people are trying to do that.
Hey, Thomas. You froze again. You were saying, what's the most major flaw? Then you froze.
Oh, okay. What would be like the main aspect missing from the equation? Because maybe the inner part is being like developed, or at least like people are
It's
practicing.
a social environment. I mean, a lot of the things you think you're reflecting on internally are already constrained by the narratives of the society you're in. Yeah, they act as what Deleuze called an assemblage, or in complexity is called a strange attractor. So you're never thinking independently of reality. And I think that's a lot of the mistake. You can see this in a lot of the idea. You can see it in what I call faux Buddhism. The American adoption of a weird form of Buddhism in terms of reflection and distance, or Wilber's, inner outer type stuff and things like that. All of these basically create these dichotomies, and all of them fundamentally focus on the individual as the primary unit rather than the collective. Now, if you look at it, Latin America in the main, Africa, Southern Europe, the Celtic fringe of the UK, indigenous communities in Australia see the world as connected, and they see the primary analysis as being based on who you interact with, not who you are. And the science is now starting to back that up. There's a lovely test on this from Geography of Thought. You ask people which is the odd one out of cow, chicken, or grass. And you can more or less guarantee that most Northern Europeans and North Americans will get rid of grass because cow and chicken are animals. Whereas most Latin Americans, Africans, Celts, etc., will get rid of chicken because the cow has got a relationship with grass and they think in terms of relationships, not categories. Now, I think that's where we are. And again, it's a deficiency of AI because AI has come out of that North Atlantic tradition. Yeah. Which is also, by the way, very, very based on text. Yeah.
Yeah. But how would in a practical way, how would people come to making like this, adding to their lives this kind of collective aspect, let's say?
Well, one of the ways we do it with individuals is we get them to identify what they call the actants in their environment. So this comes from actor network theory. So not only people have agency, physical objects do as well. So they identify all the constraints, all the constructors, which are types of processes or rituals, all the actors in their world. They map those onto a grid between energy cost of change and time to change. Yeah. And then they look at that map, and anything top right on that map, realistically, they're not going to be able to change. Then they start to change the things on the map. So they change the environment so that their behavioral changes. They don't start with their behavior. They start with their interactions and the environment in which they're working. So you can get really pragmatic very quickly with this stuff, and you can then compare their individual energy gradient with that of their company, with that of their society. You can start to get it much more realistic about what can happen. And you also get rid of the guilt. One of the other problems I've got with this whole focus on the inner self with mental models, is that it blames the individual for everything which goes wrong. Yeah, and Daniel and others have always argued against that.
Now, on that, I was hearing a talk of yours. I mean, a few weeks ago, I think. And you were talking about this difference between present mapping and like how do you say
Future.
like yeah, and mainly like scenario planning, let's say.
Yeah. I mean,
Is this related?
yeah, very related. So, I mean, this comes from quantum mechanics, from Deutsch's work. It basically says whatever has the lowest energy gradient is what's most likely to happen anyway. So if you can accurately map the energy gradients of the present, you've got better predictive capacity. And if you get a group of people in a room to discuss forces and factors, produce a 2x2 matrix and write 5 scenarios. Yeah. So, and you can also do that in real time and update it in real time.
Is this being actually like have you tested all this and the
You're freezing again, Thomas.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm in the hills, and it's the signal is so crazy. Have you actually tried put to test this kind of like difference between like planning and mapping, the present mapping, let's say, and are there actual benefits from doing that?
Yeah, it's a major conflict resolution device. We've already seen that on several projects. Because if people talk about the present state, it's subjective, they can reach agreement. Whereas if they're talking about future states, it gets very political very quickly. So part of my argument is the more accurate we can describe the present, the easier it is to work out where you should go next.
Okay, so that's what I was hearing. Now that you say people should like first you should gather people and make them come into agreement about what's true about the situation and where we go.
What they can change. Yeah, and then it becomes a lot easier. And the other thing you can do is say, well, how do we make this environment different? So instead of deciding, I want strategically to plant cacti, yeah, you first of all have to say, is my garden suitable for cacti, and do I need to do things to make it more suitable before I commit? So what is called estuary mapping is a real risk reduction device.
So that's the same. That's another concept. Is estuary mapping.
And estuary mapping is our phrase to cover affordance mapping, which is the energy time, assemblage mapping, which is the narrative patterns which determine how you see the world, and also agency, what level of agency you give people. So and for all of that, we use the metaphor of an estuary, because in an estuary, the water goes in and the water goes out. It doesn't always flow in one direction. Yeah, kairos or timeliness is absolutely important. There are things you can do at the turn of the tide. Granite cliffs you can check every 30 years. Sandbanks you have to check every tidal turn. Yeah, so it's a powerful metaphor to describe the organization.
Now, a main issue came up when I was like listening to you talk about these subjects. Was what's the importance of like actually being like the embodiment? I mean, like being people in a full context, like instead of in a digital kind of environment.
Well,
Does it change anything?
I mean, we work digitally. We're working digitally now, but we also work physically. You have to realize the limits of digital, because you're not getting complete visual stimulation. You're not getting complete audio stimulation. You're getting no olfactory stimulation, which you normally use to determine trust. So it's limited. And the other thing you don't get is you don't get the peripheral vision and the side conversations. Yes, I was in Brazil recently, which is fascinating because I was meant to be running a retreat and I don't speak Portuguese. So I had sort of somebody whispering in my ear, and people whose English was okay but not brilliant, and people were whispering their ears. And it worked out quite well, actually. But the real value on that retreat was the conversations after dinner, the conversations over a drink, the conversations after you finish speaking. That's where the real value came. The human beings work really well in the periphery. We don't work very well directly.
Yeah, I mean, all those aspects missing. I mean, from digital world to like embodied world, let's say. Is that also an issue with around sense making in the social media landscape, let's say? Because
Yeah,
I
it
heard you.
is.
Yeah.
I mean, conflict increases much faster because you've got no physical inhibition. You can't listen to the tone of somebody's voice, so you can misread it very quickly. The other point is it's called buffering, all right? So a friend of mine in the Mounties has a good way of saying this. He says it used to be every village had an idiot, and it didn't matter because everybody knew who the idiot was. But now the idiots are banded together on the internet to legitimize idiocy. So the danger with social media is there's no buffering, there's no human interaction, which normally inhibits the emergence of dangerous patterns.
And how would we come about solving this kind of unbuffered feedback?
Well, the example I gave of using young people as ethnographers is one way to do it. So you've got a digital combination of data, but you've got a physical origination of data. We're trying next year to get our whole team together at least once or twice a year, just so that there is that interaction. Now, that is going to get more difficult, and we're going to have to rethink some of that. But then you've got to think about multiple side conversations, and the technology isn't yet up to this. And what's actually quite interesting is when people build technology, they try and replicate the physical, and that doesn't work because it just confuses you. What you need to use semiotics so that people see patterns and then have conversations. But if you have them in a virtual world which tries to replicate the physical world, they just get confused. We used to do some really good work on this in IBM with Wendy's group at Hawthorne, but I couldn't get it into the market because everybody thought that you had to replicate the physical in the virtual. They used a brilliant architect, designer, Tracy, who used to design wonderful systems by which you could look at a screen and instantly see who was interacting with who and where, and click on things and have conversations. And you never got confused because it was all symbolic. None of it was trying to represent reality.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, but when you the things you actually could take to market, did you see any difference, like actual difference between like groups working in a physical way instead of digital in a digital
Oh yeah,
environment? Oh yeah,
huge.
huge.
Yeah, I mean, particularly when we try and do workshops afternoon and morning, so people have the evening to chat. Yeah, you're trying to increase the non-formal aspect of human communication. So, and this is more general, by the way. Informal networks are more important than formal systems in problem solving in companies. So this working informally, working in the implicit, working around the edges, human beings are at their best in that environment.
Sorry, I actually, yes, I heard you talking about informal networks. Can you please like make a brief explanation of what they are and what role do
Okay,
they?
so when I was in IBM, I did a huge study on this, and there were 64 informal communities to every one formal, and those were the only ones using the technology. So an informal network is people you like and get on with, and you meet and have a drink and talk about things. Or people who support the same football club. That's actually one of the fastest ways in. Yeah, if you put a bunch of Liverpool supporters together in the UK, they're going to get on. I mean, they're definitely going to agree Manchester supporters are evil, yeah, whether it's United or City. So, yeah, and people create these markers and you trust people within those groups. So one of our techniques, for example, in Tangled Trios or social network stimulation, focus on building the informal networks. So everybody can get to the CEO within 3 phone calls. And that creates a resilient organization, but you could never do that with a formal design. It's got to be, it's like the fungal roots and entangled tree roots. It's rhizomic, it's not arboreal.
Okay, so you actually build into a business, let's say an organization, informal networks
No,
to make it
we
more
stimulate
resilient.
that. We stimulate their formation.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Because they should emerge like organically. That's the
yeah. So
idea.
well, not completely. You use what are called enabling constraints. So let's give you an IT example. Instead of sending out a systems analyst to interview people, we'll put people together in groups of 3. So somebody really experienced in IT, like an architect with a big picture view, somebody young and bright, fast prototyping, and a user trained to talk to IT people, because it's easier to do that, train IT people to understand users. And then we'll throw 15, 20, 30 trios at a problem for a month or so and see what they come up with. Now, A, we produce a much better design, but B, we're creating networks between users and IT people which wouldn't normally exist, which they can fall back on when things go wrong. So by running, and we've done that with people who just joined the company, with people about to retire, with people on the management fast track. We're now doing it with groups of 5 or 7 for distributed decision making. You're creating these low-level micro interactions and constantly switching the membership so that sooner or later everybody is within 3 degrees of separation of everybody else.
So that you just said would be an example of an what you called an enabling constraint.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there any other types you
Oh,
should
yes.
like?
I mean,
I,
creating boundaries. So negative stories, for example, act as an enabling constraint. It's much easier to agree what we don't want to be than agree what we do want to be. So if you have an agreement on what we're not going to be, you know people won't go there, but you leave open different pathways of exploration. So people shouldn't see constraints as negative; they're often positive.
okay. So is this maybe I got it wrong, but I heard you talking about like how it's better for people to have examples of failure than
Yeah,
examples of
yeah,
like.
that's another point again, but it's critical. So if you look at fairy stories, and this is true in Latin America as it's true in indigenous Australia, everywhere. The stories we tell our children are stories of failure, not success. Because avoidance of failure is a more successful strategy for survival and imitation of success. So worst practice systems work well. The human brain picks up failure fast. It may ignore success. And again, it's this concept of learning what to avoid leaves open novel possibilities in the future. having specific goals or best practice actually reduces novelty in the system and reduces adaptability. So we build worst practice databases, and we can use fictional form for that. We can use architectural form. As for learning, you don't need the truth. You need people's reflections. People get this confused. Yeah, they think lessons learned should be about the truth. Actually, it isn't. Imagination is as important. How successful teams imagine they could have failed will tell you a damn sight more than how they actually succeeded.
Yeah. So do you actually like use this kind of or this kind of technology inside like addressing novelty or coming up with new
Yeah,
solutions
and
and
then
things like that?
SenseMaker, which is our software, can do that. It can measure culture because it doesn't approach problems directly, it approaches them indirectly. It gathers contextual data which people interpret rather than asking them arbitrary questions. All of that gives you that sort of, it's called a substrate in physics. You need to understand the substrate, the environment in which you're working. Yeah, it's far more important than anything else.
And is this like applicable to different, like have you tested this in different kind of contexts like business or education or different
Yeah,
like
education, not-for-profit, business, all sectors of business. I mean, narrative is a human universal, and it's how we tell stories. Yeah, we don't write factual reports. We tell stories. And I've done a lot of work with civil engineers, and I'll tell you now, civil engineers who are deeply pragmatic people, they tell stories, and if they don't like you, they won't tell you the stories you need to survive.
yeah, is this related? With the new materialism you were speaking the other day. I was hearing the Stoa, a conversation you gave, a webinar you gave at the Stoa, and you talk about new materialism, how
Yeah,
actually these narratives actually have a material like effect or material.
yeah, that's assemblage theory from Deleuze, which has been picked up in new materialism by Fox, Delander, etc. But yeah, the whole point about humans is abstractions have material reality. They exist independently of the people. Yeah, it's quite interesting. It's one of the reasons why you'll find a lot of people are saying kind of like you can't avoid religion if you're a human, because abstraction has been so important to our evolution. And if you look at someone like Richard Dawkins, he's creating a new religion called atheism. Yeah, and he acts like an Old Testament prophet at times in the way he preaches it, right? So I think, yeah, and you can see a lot of this in evolutionary psychology. There's a fundamental underlying argument now that human beings need abstractions. And religion is the easiest way of dealing with that. But you also see it in the way that populists like Trump work. What they're doing is they're creating a belief system, an abstraction, and that creates something people fall into because it's easier to fall into that than to think about it rationally. So these things are all positive and negative. But again, it's part of what it is to be human. And we evolved to make decisions in sexual pairs, extended families, and clans. Yeah, and that's where we're comfortable. We're not comfortable in nation states. There's just too many people.
And how is that a problem actually? Like being nation states, like versus how the group or the couples or pairs actually are better
It's
for decision making.
because you haven't got the human contact. It's much easier to hate people.
Yeah.
I mean, some of our work, for example, is to get children to gather stories, identify stories in common across a political divide, and then get people from the different political factions to work together on something which they already have in common. What we're trying to do is increase empathy between people, not discuss why they should like each other, but just get them to realize the other person is a human. And that's kind of like the key stage one.
And are the results interesting?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The
Positive?
first time I was ever in Latin America was the 70s. We were working on peace and reconciliation in Ireland. And instead of getting everybody in the big hall to agree they should be nice to each other, we took two Catholics and one Protestant, or two Protestants and one Catholic, and we dumped them into the slums of Rio de Janeiro on an ecumenical project for 3 months. And they learned pretty fast. They had more in common than they realized, and they had conversations about their differences in the context of working together. So that's the sort of thing we're now starting to do at scale. I'm not sure I do it in Rio anymore, but then there was a lot of respect for the priests. So provided you went through the church, people were fairly safe.
So it's mainly like relocating people from different backgrounds and different
it's increasing empathy.
Okay, that's the main goal.
Empathy is the way you counter hate.
Okay, and does it actually work?
Yeah.
That's
Creates
great.
lasting relationships.
So, how would we come to practice that on a daily basis? Let's say.
Well, I've just given you the example using institutions. So we're using schools, using sports clubs as your primary ethnographers. Seeing common patterns. What you don't want is, somewhat ironically, given what I've said, you want to do this algorithmically so it's not subject to political corruption. And we've been doing a lot of work on how you get rid of corruption in allocation of resources into poor communities. And you do that by doing things algorithmically in ways which can't be gamed.
Yeah, actually, yes. I saw a study maybe a few years ago about how people actually made better decisions when they had when the groups were actually diverse instead of like being whole groups of similar people.
Diverse and small. They have to be 7 or less.
7 or less. Okay.
Yeah. Maximum number of decision makers in the extended family.
Oh, yeah, I heard you talk about that. But why is that? What happens after 7 or?
It's called evolution. Once you go above that, people fall into their clans. So once you go above about 7 people, people sort of want to be accepted by other people who they see as similar to them. So then they start to form into those clans. Then you get disruption in the clan-based decision making. Yeah, you can't depart from the norm because the clan has got to stay together. In a family, you can depart from the norm because you can rely on the family staying together regardless.
Okay, so you gotta transcend it's gotta be like bigger than 7 for it to be like to actually got like
No, but that's why you want lots and lots of small groups, and you want to see what works, and you want resource to follow the things which are working, not the people who say they can make things work.
Okay, yeah. There was another topic. It has nothing to do with actually it does, but I wanted to make a brief because I think people usually fall into the trap of confusing what you consider complex and complicated, like actually seeing things as complicated when they are actually complex, and therefore treat them as if they were complicated. And can you please define a bit of what the differences are?
The easiest way to this is to look at the root of the words in English. So complicated comes from a Latin root word which means folded, and something which can be folded could be unfolded and folded and it doesn't change. The Greek origin of complex is something which is entangled. Yeah, like the roots of a mangrove swamp or bramble bushes. And something which is entangled can't be unentangled and tangled again. And it has high path dependency. So you can never start from scratch. And that's probably the fastest way to understand the difference.
Okay, because I think something it's actually important from my perspective is the fact that when you actually make a change in a complex system, it's actually like unpredictable what the output is going to be. Or
You do see patterns. So, for example, a termite's nest, all right, they're all different, but they have a common pattern to them, even though they're all emergent properties. So, I mean, I blogged on this recently. You do see regularities in the complex system. And if you can live with variation within those regularities, you've still got a level of predictive capability. Yeah, so it's important to realize you can still manage complexity. Too many people, particularly in the agile community, do it's complex, so I can't be held responsible for anything. Well, that's just nonsense. Yeah, complexity requires more rather than less discipline.
Okay, and if it can't actually perceive any kind of patterns, that would be chaos. That's the chaos is when you
If there's no
can
discernible pattern, that's chaotic.
okay.
And that's randomness, yeah. But that never lasts for long in a human system
Why is that? What happens then?
because we don't like it. Human beings dislike randomness. We create order fast.
But how can you actually transcend or solve the state of chaos?
Oh, because somebody will come in and impose order or create some constraint or, shoot a few people so that they can't disrupt it anymore. Human beings are quite good at this, right? We create order.
Yeah, I mean, it should be an order that is capable of like viable in like facing chaos. I mean, because if not,
Well, possibly, but the point is chaos won't last for long, and what
okay,
comes out of it may or may not be viable, but in a human system, we don't like it.
okay, yeah, I see a bit of maybe this. I know it's not your definition, but I was I feel like lots of your like your concepts actually facing complexity actually bring like simple kind of solutions. I see something like organic simple about it because it's like I don't know.
Yeah, it
It's
is.
related to the natural.
Complexity is really very, very simple. Yeah. There's only, you can change the actants, you can change the interactions, you can change the energy allocation. That's all you can really do. Now, at the same time, you have got ordered systems, and ordered systems can be maintained and they're predictable, but they're more expensive. So you've got more predictability, but they take more energy. Complex systems release energy into the system, but they're less predictable.
And like having ordered systems and complex systems, let's say it's complex systems preferable to ordered systems in
No,
energy
no,
when it comes.
they depend on the context. I mean, I really don't want people driving on the left-hand side of the road on the right-hand side of the road in the UK. Thank you very much. Yeah, I mean that order is actually quite useful. Yeah.
So that's another thing. Maybe how's context so important? Because we tend to like make one solution universal and think that
You
maybe
can't do that. There's too many variations. Yeah, so something which works at a national level might not work at a local level or a regional level. I mean, it's interesting in the UK, for example, a lot of health policy is based on the big teaching hospitals in London. Well, in London, you're never more than 10 minutes away from a hospital by ambulance. If you come where I grew up in North Wales, it can take you 6 hours to get to a hospital. And that's a completely different system. The context is changing.
yeah, because I see all the time this kind of like taking one thing that works in one way in one context and applying it to a whole other set of contexts that have nothing to do with it.
It's been a big problem in management consultancy because they tend to do the original work on American manufacturing companies, which are closed systems within a leadership orientated culture. So you can't take something from that and move it into a service relationship in Italy, for God's sake, which is a completely different environment. But methods have nearly always come sideways from manufacturing, and that's an error. Because manufacturing is always an ordered system.
Yeah, it is. And one more thing I wanted to ask you is if you're like actually working on something right now that you'd like to like anything new and new discoveries, anything interesting you'd like to talk about.
Big stuff we're working on is distributed decision making, and we'll be ready to talk about that in about a couple of months. Yeah.
Okay, so no, not right now.
Not right now.
Can you maybe define what that is, or not?
Yeah, it's how do you allocate small amounts of money without bureaucracy, or small amounts of decision authority without bureaucracy, with full recording and using a thing called the panopticon effect. So you have an unseen observer, which gets rid of corruption. And then real investment follows things which are working rather than things that people say will work. So that's the big one we're working on. And we're working on simulation environments to test out who needs to be involved at the moment.
So maybe potential solutions to like excessive bureaucracy and corruption.
Oh yeah. So we think we can take out 50% of the bureaucracy of a British hospital, for example. We think we can allow development banks to actually not allocate huge sums of money, but allow very small amounts of money to go into local communities and see what works before they commit the resource. So this is big, right? If we get this to work, it's huge.
Yeah, 50% sounds big. That's great. That's
Well,
great.
if you think about the amount of levels, I mean, it's huge because they're generally confirming stuff which people know anyway. And so, doctors and nurses can make decisions with parents quite quickly, but the risk is high for the administrators. So they put bureaucracy in place to reduce the risk. So it doesn't take much to break that, and you can save a huge amount of money quite quickly.
How about in the context of academia, let's say, which is also filled with bureaucracy?
Academic, I think one of the problems is there are too many universities these days. It used to be in the UK, for example, 5% of the population went to university. And I was lucky then, and we were fully funded. We had grants, our fees were paid, and we had it was like monastic. You had the total freedom to explore things. But then everybody had to go to university, and good polytechnics and technical colleges became poor rated universities. Yeah, and apprentice schemes were abandoned. And that's the trouble. We went into these universal models rather than recognizing context specific. So I think education needs a bad shake-up. It needs more autonomy. I mean, we had a headmaster who taught, right? In the modern school, no headmaster teaches. They're all bureaucracies. And he was an English teacher. He knew Shakespeare by heart. He never had a teaching plan in his life. He'd turn up at the class and decide what to teach. And he got straight A's in all his kids. He wouldn't survive in a modern educational system.
Okay, so it would be great to when did you say you're gonna release like this kind of new research?
Keep an eye on the blog. We'll probably set up a research club about it in January. So if people are prepared to sign up for that and accept an NDA, we'll involve them early.
Okay, that's great news. Because I'll be working on maybe some uh design for educational design in my old university. So I want to keep in touch with all this new research.
Yeah, we should probably link you with the guys in Brazil because I'm probably going to be coming out to teach at one of the Brazilian universities as part of that deal.
Okay, that would be great.
I know it's Portuguese, not Spanish, but there's enough in common for you to have conversations.
Yeah. I can learn Portuguese.
Yeah.
Okay, that's great news. Where does people keep up with all your stuff, Dave? Where can they reach you or follow you? Blog?
I've just put up a blog today which summarizes all the blogs from last year.
Okay, great. So blog is I put the link in the description, but it's mainly the Cynefin blog, right? Okay, Dave.
Yeah, that's it.
It's been great to talk with you.
And you.
Okay,
Cheers.
let's keep in touch. Bye.